The idea of waiting on God here in verse 31, but they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. That goes against all human nature. If we want something to happen, I remember my mother when I was a young person. I remember saying to Mama one time, well, I want this. My mother and father looked at me and said, well, if you want that, you better work for it. And so I was taught from a very early age that I needed to stretch myself and work for whatever it is I want. But yet Isaiah says here in the scripture, and my faith is based on waiting on God and waiting on God's timing for things to be right. The idea of waiting should go against everything that we know to be true. You know, if we want something to happen, usually it takes action. It requires that we do something. And yet, verse 31 clearly says that we are to wait on the Lord. The word wait, I want us to look at that word for just a minute, because there is no English word that is the equivalent to the Hebrew word that is used there. And so we have some of our Bibles will translate that word wait. And some of our Bibles will translate that word as hope. And what that word literally means, we would have to have a couple of different words in order to translate that word properly. That Hebrew word that is given there, that is used, yeah, I thought I had it in my note. Oh well. But that Hebrew word that is used there, if it were literally translated, would mean waiting with an eager anticipation. It means more than waiting on God, and it means more than hoping in God. It means that while we're waiting on God to make things happen, or to give us the green light, if you will, that we are waiting with an eager anticipation and expectation of what God is about to accomplish in our lives. And I think that if we look at this and if we understand that Hebrew word a little bit better, then it actually is not an oxymoron at all. What it is a promise for those who wait with eager expectation on the Lord. It is a promise that those individuals will have their strength renewed. So I want to think back to Daniel. I want to think back to Shadrach, to Meshach, and Abednego. Those young men, in the face of opposition, remained faithful. They waited on God. Their faith was the most important thing in their lives. Now, did that mean that their life was easy? Absolutely not. Did it mean that they were exempt from pressures from the heathen people who had captured them? No. In fact, just the opposite. They were under great pressure to lay aside their beliefs and to fall into line with those around them. But they did not do that. They waited. They hoped in the Lord. Their trust was in the Lord. And they anticipated God. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were about to be thrown into the fiery furnace and they stood before Nebuchadnezzar, They said that even if God would not save them from death, it would be better for them to die. I'm paraphrasing, but it would be better for them to die, and they would rather die than to defy the living God. And God did save them from that death in that scenario. So when we are waiting on God, when we are hoping in God, when we choose to place our trust in God, then our focus shifts from our present situation to something in the future. It means that our focus shifts off of our immediate problems, our immediate trials, and it is focused on something that we believe that God will accomplish in our lives in the future. And so it sharpens our focus on what God would want us to do in the days ahead. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and even David, before he was thrown into the den of lions as his punishment, they could have chosen to say, well, if we die, we can't serve God. So it's better to violate God's commandments and live so that we can serve God later. No. They said, we are willing to sacrifice our lives because we believe that God is capable of raising the dead. We believe that there is more to our faith than the here and now. If you will, go with me in your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And I want to consider something the Apostle Paul says here in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Down in verse 18 of that chapter, the Apostle Paul writes these amazing words. And Paul says, and we all, with unveiled face, behold the glory of the Lord. Beholding the glory of the Lord, are being, and I have underlined this section, are being transformed. Okay, so those of us who wait upon the Lord, as our focus is on what God would have us to be and what He expects out of us in the future, while we are waiting with eager expectation, we are in the process of going through a spiritual and sometimes physical change. The Apostle Paul says that we are being transformed into the image, into the same image, from one degree of glory to another. He says, for this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Okay, so we are created in the image and likeness of God. Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 3 make that quite clear, that man was created in the image and likeness of God. I believe that that is both a physical and a spiritual image. And I believe that our Bibles would back that up. But everyone, every human being is made in the physical image of God. But those who are waiting on the Lord and have their focus in a forward-thinking, futuristic mind, we are then being transformed into the spiritual likeness of Jesus Christ. We are being changed, molded, and shaped into what God would have us to become. The Apostle Paul, also in writing to the Roman Christians in Romans chapter 2 and in verse 12, chapter 12, verse 2, says this, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. It is all part of the process. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, David, Daniel, so many Old Testament figures of faith were changed as a result of having their focus in the right place.